Hello, and welcome to Building Identity, Building Community, Transgender History in the 20th Century. My name is Meredith Plummer, my pronouns are they, them, and I am the Director of Congregational Life at Miami Valley Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in Dayton, Ohio. Today our speaker is Tony Pankuch. Tony is a museum educator, public historian, and LGBTQ+ advocate based in Akron, Ohio. They are a frequent speaker on LGBTQ+ history and inclusion at regional and national conferences, including the American Alliance of Museums and the American Association for State and Local History. We are so excited Tony could be with us today. Thank you for being with us today, too.
I am really honored to be here sharing this history with y'all. So before we get into the presentation, just a little bit about me. As I said, my name is Tony Pankuch. My pronouns are they, them. I am a museum educator, public historian, and LGBTQ+ advocate based in Akron, Ohio. My day job is at the Cummings Center for the History of Psychology, which is a museum and archive dedicated to the history of psychology here in Akron. I also co-lead the Akron LGBTQ+ Archive, which is an archive dedicated to recording local LGBTQ+ history through detailed interviews and physical collections from community elders and leaders. I'm also co-chair of the LGBTQ+ professionals community of the American Alliance of Museums. I've been involved with the American Alliance of Museums for about 5 years now. This is me and the rest of the sort of leadership crew of that committee at the most recent conference. And I am, a huge lover of museums, and I'm a huge lover of history. Historical research has played a major role in my own self-discovery as a proudly queer, non-binary person. And it's so important for queer folks to see ourselves reflected in society and culture. And historical evidence reminds people that, we have always existed in history, and the record clearly shows that. So just to give you kind of a few examples to kick us off of early or not necessarily early, but early American gender nonconforming history. As long as human society has existed and assigned specific cultural signifiers to manhood and womanhood, there have been people who exist outside of those cultural norms. Here in North America, we can look to any number of indigenous communities for whom two-spirit and gender nonconforming identities were acknowledged and even celebrated. Two-spirit is a modern umbrella term, but basically numerous tribal groups, including the Ojibwe, Blackfoot, and Lakota, have had their own specific sort of cultural identities and terms for individuals who identify beyond binary gender. European colonists in the US also defied gendered norms in various ways. One of my favorite examples of this is the person on the left, the public universal friend, who was born in 1752. They were a traveling born-again preacher who traveled across the US and who rejected their birth name and rejected any gendered clothing or pronouns. They adopted a non-binary identity for themselves, even in the late 1700s. In the 19th century, there's evidence of many individuals fleeing west to the American frontier to build new lives and a new gender identity for themselves. Mrs. Nash, pictured on the right, was a laundress in General Custer's 7th Cavalry. She was well-liked and she married multiple men throughout her life. It was only after her death in 1878 that she was discovered to have been a trans woman. She was assigned male at birth. And there are many more examples like this from the American West of folks who sort of left their home and their identity in the East and moved west in order to establish themselves with a new gender. Now, one of the key sort of distinctions here, though, is that while gender nonconforming people have always existed, the term transgender did not. The trans community, as it is defined today, is a relatively recent linguistic and cultural development. Trans people in Europe and the US prior to the 20th century often did not have much in the way of language or community to sort of describe and relate to their experiences. And many trans people were isolated, experiencing desires and feelings that were difficult to express to the people around them. So the question I want to address today is, oh, we're getting some feedback here. I've got some music playing. All right, I think we're good now. So the question I want to address today is, how did we go from individual gender nonconforming people to an honest-to-goodness trans community? And so I'm going to take us through this history beginning in the late 19th century through the 20th century. I will not be able to cover everything because we only have so much time, but I'll give you sort of the highlight reel and spotlight some major individuals and organizations in this history. So I want to begin in Europe in the late 19th century. The social sciences are on the rise, and there is a growing desire to better understand and categorize human experiences and behaviors. This includes the experience of gender expression and sexuality. There's a new field of study that's developing called sexology, or the study of human sexual behavior. And early sexologists were not great at distinguishing between sexual orientation and gender identity in the way that we do today. So, for instance, one of the most popular English sexologists was a man named Havelock Ellis, who described a condition known as sexual inversion. Inversion was defined as a mismatched or inverted sexual drive. This condition was blamed for both gender nonconforming behavior, such as cross-dressing, and homosexuality. In this way, gender and sexuality were conflated into one specific term. Now, Havelock Ellis is a really unique historical figure. Homosexuality and cross-dressing were both illegal throughout much of Europe, and many early sexologists conducted their research with criminal populations. That is, people who had already been arrested for these behaviors and were isolated in harsh prison environments. But Havelock Ellis was unique in that he tried to work with and understand a broader population. Havelock Ellis corresponded with a wide variety of LGBTQ+ people outside of the criminal justice system. Some of these were Ellis's existing friends and acquaintances, and others were people who read his books and reached out to him. Some of the folks who wrote in to Ellis disagreed with his theories because they had their own experiences that ran contrary to what he was writing. And they took their time to share their experiences and to share their own concepts of queer identity. One of his most prominent correspondents was Edward Carpenter. Carpenter was a poet, a philosopher, and an early gay rights advocate. And he was one of many queer individuals who took an active role in the early construction of LGBTQ+ identity. He helped to construct this idea that being gay and being trans are two different things. And even though people like Carpenter lacked the medical authority of sexologists, they still advocated for themselves by writing in and sharing their experiences. Across the pond here in the US, a similar dynamic formed between a sexologist named Alfred Herzog and an individual who went by the names Jennie June, Ralph Werther, and Earl Lind. For simplicity, I'm going to refer to this person as Jennie June, even though they used multiple names throughout their life. So Jennie June was born in 1874 in Connecticut. Throughout their life, they struggled with their sense of self in terms of both sexual desire and gender identity. They described themselves as a combination of male and female, and they expressed a desire to become a woman. Based on June's writings, we might today consider them to be non-binary or a transgender woman. June shared their experiences with Alfred Herzog, the sexologist, who published it in 1918. Now, Herzog published this as a medical case study, a detailed account of a psychologically unique individual. And even though it was published as a medical text intended for doctors and psychologists and people diagnosing different conditions, it is still a compelling human narrative. It was titled Autobiography of an Androgyne. And it's through Jennie June's autobiography that we know a lot about what it was like to be trans in the US in the early 20th century. For instance, Jennie June's autobiography provides us with the only information that we have on an organization called the Circle Hermaphroditos. The Circle Hermaphroditos was a transgender support and advocacy group founded in New York City in the 1890s. Little is known about this group other than what Jennie June wrote in her autobiography, but it is the first dedicated community organization for trans people in documented US history. And so Jennie June provides a really great example of how medical professionals, whether they intended to or not, helped to amplify the voices of trans people at the sort of turn of the 20th century. Now, back in Germany, another sexologist was sort of pushing the field forward. His name was Magnus Hirschfeld, and he was interested in both scientific research around sexuality as well as social activism for LGBTQ plus people. Hirschfeld was one of the first people to clearly distinguish between gender identity and sexuality in his writing, and he coined the term transsexuality in 1923. Now, in 1919, Hirschfeld founded the Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin. This institute was a first-of-its-kind facility dedicated to the study of human sexuality and gender. Hirschfeld was an advocate for transgender people. He worked with and employed many trans people. He provided referrals for some of the earliest gender-affirming surgeries and treatments. One of the people he consulted with was Lely Elbe, who was a Danish painter whose experience as a trans woman was famously depicted in the book and movie The Danish Girl. So if you've seen The Danish Girl, there's a sequence in that movie where she actually goes to Hirschfeld's institute for consultation on her treatment. And this is really sort of a major point in the history of LGBTQ identity. Hirschfeld assembled a massive library of research and knowledge on sexuality and gender. He really pushed the field forward and made a serious effort to decriminalize and, create acceptance for LGBTQ plus people, both in Germany and abroad. Unfortunately, even though Hirschfeld's work represented a major step forward, it was not long-lived. The rise of Nazism in Germany led to an immediate backlash against Magnus Hirschfeld. He was, after all, both gay and Jewish. He was actually traveling the world in 1933 when Adolf Hitler came to power, and he was never able to return to his home country. In 1933, the Institute for Sexual Research was raided by the Nazis, and its entire library was destroyed. It was burned. It was one of the first documented book burnings of the Nazi regime. And this was one of the world's most advanced collections of research and literature on gender and sexuality. And it was gone. So in 1933, this whole field is placed in a very precarious place by the destruction of Hirschfeld's institute. His legacy in trans healthcare did live on, however, specifically through a man named Harry Benjamin. Harry Benjamin was a physician who had studied at Hirschfeld's Institute in Berlin before ultimately immigrating to the US. In the late 1940s, Benjamin began to focus his career on gender-affirming care for transgender people. He pioneered the use of hormones like estrogen and testosterone in gender-affirming care. And throughout the mid-20th century, he became one of the United States' most well-known experts on trans identity. Similar to the dialogue between Havelock Ellis and Edward Carpenter, Harry Benjamin maintained contacts with a network of transgender people who informed his perspective on gender identity and influenced his sympathies toward the trans community. One example of this is Louise Lawrence. Lawrence was an outspoken trans woman who began living full-time as a woman in 1942. Throughout the 1940s, she spoke publicly and candidly about her experiences as a trans woman. She placed personal ads in magazines in order to meet other trans people. And she formed sort of a network of pen pals with trans people all over the country. She also interfaced directly with the medical community, including people like Harry Benjamin, and her visibility allowed her to sort of connect trans people with medical providers and really pass information between those two communities. Her home in San Francisco actually became a way station for any trans person seeking medical care in California. Now, when we talk about the development of a trans community, Lawrence is a key figure in this history. Her bravery in speaking openly about her identity helped so many trans people to find support and mentorship in the mid-20th century, and it helped to defeat those feelings of isolation that so many trans people were experiencing. Now, another one of Harry Benjamin's correspondents was a very famous individual, a former military clerical worker who turned into an international celebrity overnight. Her name was Christine Jorgensen. At age 25, Jorgensen left home in the United States to travel to Denmark in order to receive gender-affirming surgery. This was in the early 1950s. She returned home in 1952. But before she got on her plane, a letter that she sent to her parents leaked to the press. Upon her return, she found herself in the middle of a media circus. Reporters were literally meeting her as she got off of her plane to report on and snap photos of this sort of new development in human gender and sex. Headlines around the country declared XGI becomes blonde beauty. Her name and her picture were everywhere, and she was the inaugural international face of trans identity. Jorgensen's transition was so widely covered, and it marked the first time that trans identity was placed in the public spotlight. For many people, Christine was the first trans person they ever saw. And for better or worse, after Christine Jorgensen transitioned, transsexuality became a household term around the country. You see a firestorm of books and movies and opinion pieces, all inspired by the story of Christine Jorgensen. And suddenly people are able to ask the question, can a man become a woman, and can a woman become a man? Is this possible? Following the media firestorm around Christine Jorgensen, gender-affirming care becomes increasingly visible and accessible throughout the 50s and the 60s. In 1966, the first clinic dedicated to gender-affirming surgery opened in Baltimore, Maryland. This was the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic, and it was immediately popular. Within the first 5 months of the clinic's existence, its surgeons provided gender-affirming care for 10 different patients, and that number continued to rise throughout the history of this clinic. But developing a whole new field of healthcare is not cheap. The growing accessibility of gender-affirming care required a significant investment in education, in training, in research, and in infrastructure. And it's at this point that we have to ask ourselves the question, who is paying for all of this? Well, the answer is a man named Reed Erickson. Reed Erickson was a transgender man who was born in 1917. He was an entrepreneur and the son of a successful businessman. Erickson began transitioning in the 1950s using hormonal treatments that he purchased while on a business trip to Mexico. In 1962, he inherited a major interest in his father's business, which was a lead smelting business, and he sold that interest for a significant price. By the 1960s, Erickson was a multi-millionaire. Now, Reed Erickson was an eccentric guy. He's been referred to as the trans Howard Hughes, and his story really reflects that comparison. For instance, he had a pet leopard named Henry, who's pictured here. Henry would apparently ride with Erickson on his private jet. So he would take Henry with him in his travels, just on this private jet, a leopard in the cabin with him. He was also deeply interested in alternative medicines. He poured funding into research on dreams, altered states of consciousness, and even the possibility of human beings communicating with dolphins. This guy was really enthusiastic about the idea of ECT or ESP, sort of extrasensory communication. But his biggest contribution was to the development of modern gender-affirming care. In 1966, Erickson founded the Erickson Educational Foundation, which provided hundreds of thousands of dollars to support the development of gender-affirming care. In particular, it was the Erickson Foundation that subsidized the new Johns Hopkins Gender Clinic. The foundation also maintained referral networks for patients and produced pamphlets and other literature to help trans people find and access gender-affirming care. Now, during this time, the terminology used for people who sought out and received gender-affirming care was transsexual. A transsexual, as defined during this era, was someone who wanted to change the physical sex of their body through hormones or through surgery. So Christine Jorgensen, Reed Erickson, and physicians like Harry Benjamin all used this terminology. But there was another term that was also common in the 20th century, which was transvestite. During this time, the term transvestite referred to a person who wore the clothing of the opposite sex, but did not want to alter their body. Within this context, transvestitism required no medical intervention. Now, Virginia Price is an example of someone who identified herself as a transvestite. She was born in 1912, and she began experiencing her exploring her trans identity in the 1950s. She began writing about her identity and exploring the nuances of sex, sexuality, and gender. And in 1960, she founded a magazine called Transvestia. Transvestia was a bi-monthly magazine dedicated to trans identity that ran for 20 years. The magazine's earliest subscribers actually came from Louise Lawrence, who we talked about earlier. Louise contributed her network of trans pen pals to Virginia Prince, who was then able to sort of send those subscriptions to those individuals. Transvestia was focused on the experiences of transvestites. It was a forum for readers to ask questions, trade advice on fashion and makeup and styling themselves, to share their personal stories, and to build community. Virginia Prince is also credited with popularizing the term transgender in an effort to further separate trans identity from sexuality or biological sex. Now, many decades later, transgender will become the umbrella term for all trans people. We use it today regardless of whether or not someone is interested in hormones or surgery. But in the 1960s, the community was sharply divided. There were transvestites and there were transsexuals. And it was the doctors, people like Harry Benjamin, people who provided gender-affirming care, who reinforced and codified this fundamental division. These doctors developed detailed diagnostic criteria for transsexuals and transvestites. And so basically what they did is they said, folks who fit this collection of behaviors, these are folks that we are going to class as transsexuals, and these are folks that are going to class as transvestites. But these doctors did make mistakes. They often labeled patients who came to them seeking care as transvestites and denied those individuals access to care because of that label. The way that many doctors conceptualized these terms, they only gave access to care. They only classified people as transsexuals if the doctors themselves believed that these people could believably pass as the opposite sex after surgery. So if a doctor thought that you looked too masculine to be a woman, or if you sort of expressed interests in other women as opposed to expressing interests in men, they would deny you the opportunity to transition into a woman because you did not conform to the gender standards of that era and to the sort of sexual norms of the 1960s. Now, All this talk about gender-affirming care, of course, leaves behind a significant portion of the trans community. Just like today, there are many trans people in the mid-20th century who could not afford to even think about gender-affirming surgeries or trying to conform to heteronormative society. Throughout the 20th century, poor trans people, especially trans people of color, have faced daily violence and harassment from police, from landlords and employers, and from their own neighbors and families. The bars, restaurants, and theaters and streets where queer people congregated in the mid-20th century were subjected to frequent raids by the police, as well as violence and harassment by everyday individuals who chose to target those venues. In June of 1969, at the end of a tumultuous decade in American history, tensions between the police and the queer community exploded at the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar located in New York City's Greenwich Village neighborhood. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time diving into the Stonewall riots. It's one of the most well-known pieces of LGBTQ history in the 20th century, and many of y'all probably know the broad strokes of this event. If not, I'm happy to answer questions after the talk. But I do want to remind y'all that the Stonewall riots were not caused by cisgender people. They were largely fought by trans people, specifically trans people of color. The people who fought the Stonewall riots were sex workers, and they were poor individuals who fled to New York, often with only $1 or $2 in their pockets. They were people like Stormé de Larverie, I always get tripped up by that name, people like Stormé de Larverie and Marsha P. Johnson. Stormé was a mixed-race drag king, singer, and bodyguard whose gender identity was fluid and very much beyond the binary. Beginning in the 1950s, Stormé toured the Black theater circuit and regularly served as an MC at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. Marsha P. Johnson, meanwhile, was an icon of New York City's queer culture. She was a drag queen who, by the late 1960s, began living full-time as a transgender woman. She was known for her bright personality and her outrageous outfits, which sometimes included accessories like Christmas lights, fake fruit, and flower crowns. Both Stormé and Marsha were present for the Stonewall riots, although the full extent of their participation is unclear. Historical accounts of the riots are often chaotic and conflicting, and some have suggested that it was Stormé who incited the riots, the person who threw the first brick, so to speak, but this is heavily debated. What we do know, though, is that the Stonewall riots marked a major turn in the struggle for LGBTQ rights in the US. Prior to Stonewall, the gay rights movement was laser-focused on respectability politics. Gay activists wanted to present themselves as normal, law-abiding, average men and women. They shied away from any form of gender nonconformity. The men wore suits, the women wore dresses, and they firmly rejected any association with trans people. Now, this starts to change little by little after Stonewall. So, for instance, Marsha P. Johnson was an active member in the Gay Liberation Front, a new, more radical organization that was founded immediately after the riots. The following year, Marsha P. Johnson and another trans woman named Sylvia Rivera formed their own organization called the Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, or STAR. Through this organization, Marsha and Sylvia provided housing, food, clothing, and financial support for trans youth. The organization also advocated for prison reform and legal protections against discrimination. Unfortunately, despite this growing radicalism within the gay liberation movement, trans people did still face pushback from cisgender gays and lesbians. Some second-wave feminists, for instance, opposed the inclusion of trans women in the movement. Other prominent leaders were still afraid that trans people in general were a threat to the respectability and normality or normalcy of the gay community. In the decades that followed Stonewall, trans people continued to carve out their own safe spaces. In 1975, Fantasia Fest was founded in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Building on the networks established by Louise Lawrence and Virginia Prince, Fantasia Fair was a mix of social and educational events dedicated to promoting community and personal growth within the trans community. It was an annual event that was created by and for trans people. And Fantasia Fair acted as a model for the trans community in terms of organizing gatherings across the country. It helped to create tangible in-person connections between trans people across geography. I love this photo on the right here of Virginia Prince, sort of later in her life, together with some attendees at Fantasia Fair. The festival eventually actually rebranded itself as Trans Week, and it continues to this day, 51 years after it was founded. And it is the longest running transgender event anywhere in the world. Now, I want to pause here and note that some of y'all may have noticed that aside from Reed Erickson, who we talked about earlier, you may have noticed an absence of transgender men in this presentation. Many of the trans support networks and community organizations of the mid-20th century were geared primarily toward trans women. However, in the 1970s and the 1980s, trans men became increasingly visible. Several major newsletters and publications dedicated to the transmasculine experience were published in the 70s, such as Jude Patton's Renaissance newsletter and Mario Martino's 1977 memoir, Emergence, which was the first full-length autobiography of a transgender man published in the US. However, the biggest pioneer of this period was a man named Lou Sullivan. He began his transition in 1979. And in 1986, he began hosting quarterly get-togethers for transgender men in his home in San Francisco. As these get-togethers became more popular, he began to create a newsletter simply titled the FTM Newsletter, which became an international resource for trans men, not only in the US, but also in Europe and New Zealand. It was an international newsletter that really helped to share information on medical sort of questions and sort of community issues, social issues, all of these different things. And Sullivan's network of trans men later organized themselves into a group that was called FTM International, which is today the longest running group for trans men in the world. Central to Sullivan's activism was his identity as a gay transgender man. For much of the 20th century, it was generally believed that most transgender people were heterosexual. That is, trans men are attracted to women, trans women are attracted to men. Sullivan challenged this stereotype, and he lived openly as a gay man after his transition. Tragically, Sullivan was one of the many LGBTQ plus people whose lives were cut short by the HIV/AIDS epidemic. He died from the disease in 1991. And shortly before his death, he wrote, "You told me I couldn't live as a gay man, but now I'm going to die like one." A very sort of definitive statement on his transition and his integration into the gay male community. Now, the HIV/AIDS epidemic was utterly devastating for the entire LGBTQ plus community. But the fight against this plague did play a major role in uniting our community. Combating AIDS forced the community to work together, fostering connections beyond race and gender identity. In the 1990s, following a decade of devastating loss, a new vision of queer and trans identity emerged. It's during the 90s that transgender, that umbrella term that we use today, entered common usage, putting an end to the age-old divide between transsexual and transvestite identity. The term transgender has stuck around. You've heard me using it numerous times throughout this lecture and in the title. It's also in the 90s that we get the popularization of the LGBT acronym, cementing a vision of human rights that includes diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. Through those struggles of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the community really was able to recognize itself not as these disparate, separate groups of people, but as one unified community. In 1999, Monica Hilms, who's pictured here, created the blue, pink, and white transgender flag that we're all familiar with today. And that same year, the first Transgender Day of Remembrance was held on November 20th. This was to memorialize the brutal murders of two transgender women named Rita Hester and Chanel Pickett. This memorial, this idea of Trans Day of Remembrance, has become an annual international observance dedicated to the victims of anti-trans violence all around the world. Now, this brings us up to the new millennium and our modern conception of trans identity. The journey of trans people throughout the 20th century has been one of self-discovery and connection across geographic boundaries. The story really begins with language, terms that were originally coined by medical professionals, which over time were replaced or reclaimed by the community. This shared language has helped us to understand ourselves and build a sense of shared identity. And with that shared identity, we've been able to communicate and form community. So over the course of this presentation, I've given y'all a few sort of key highlights in this history. There is so much more to talk about that I would love to share with y'all in the Q&A. But I want to wrap up sort of the formalized presentation by just noting that as we as a community face increased backlash, misinformation, and violence against us, that sense of community is more important than ever. Trans people cannot exist without mutual aid and support, and it really is important that we connect not only with each other, but that we have those support networks with individuals outside of the trans community, that we continue to see ourselves as part of a whole LGBTQ plus community, as well as part of the broader sort of geographic communities that we live in, and to advocate for each other in that sense. And with that, I have come to the end of the formal presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I would love to take this opportunity to hear your thoughts, answer any questions, and chat about anything you might be curious about.
Well, I have a question, Tony.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned how medical transition was often gatekept by medical professionals based on cishet gender norms. I'm wondering when that started to change.
That's a great question. So that's really in the 90s that we start to get more of that sort of major push. There are seeds of this prior to that, but the standards that Harry Benjamin laid out, those standards that I mentioned were formally published by Harry Benjamin as the Benjamin Sexual Orientation Scale. It was abbreviated the SOS. And those became sort of the gold standard in transgender healthcare that were sort of gradually revised over time. So it really is a gradual process. Harry Benjamin's standards actually evolved into the modern day WPATH standards that are used in trans healthcare today. So over the course of that gradual transition, those sort of gender-based norms kind of, sort of gendered stereotypes slowly fade out. I would say that it's really in the 1990s that we really get to a system that is very similar to what we have today in terms of a much more open and affirming acceptance of trans people, not based on their ability to conform to gender norms, but based on who they say they are as individuals. To build on that a little bit more too, I'll note that one of the things I didn't really talk about is the role of psychologists and psychiatrists in all this. Many of y'all might know about the history of homosexuality in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Trans identity also had a diagnostic category, and similar to homosexuality, it took a lot of work to get that to be gradually changed and removed. And it actually has never been removed fully. And there's actually a bit of debate about this to this day. So in the 90s, again, those diagnostic criteria shift. You see more of a focus on kind of self-identification as the gold standard rather than these stereotypes. But there are trans people today who object to the fact that gender dysphoria is in the DSM as a diagnosable condition. Because for some folks, they see that as kind of pathologizing them, right? Implying that there is a disorder to their way of being. Whereas other trans people say, this diagnosis is the thing that allows us to get treatment, right? You need to have a medical diagnosis to be given a prescription. So there's that debate over whether or not that diagnosis should still exist. And if it doesn't exist, what are the mechanisms by which trans people seek out gender-affirming care? That's a very long-winded answer to a much simpler question. So thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Catherine.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the book Diary of a Klansman's Son, I think it's called? Are you familiar with that book?
I have heard of it. I have not read it.
The Klansman's Son, My Journey from White Nationalism to Anti-Racism, a Memoir. That book has a surprise ending. And that book educated me about the institute in Germany and how if you get a chance to pick up that book, at least read the ending, because you'll be like, oh, just FYI, this is a great presentation, and I might have another question, but that's all for now. Thank you.
Oh no, thank you for the recommendation. I love reading. I compiled a great big little stack of books as I was working on this presentation to check my facts. So I am always down for book recommendations. Yes, Deepak.
Yeah, hi, Tony. That was an absolutely fantastic presentation, like lucid, beautifully done.
Thank you.
I was wondering about two things. One of them is if I'm going to ask you if you've come across this person's work, and then I was going to make a connection with something in South Asia. And I was wondering if you've seen Elizabeth Rice's work, Bodies in Doubt. Have you come across any of her stuff? She's at CUNY.
I have not actually. No.
Oh, you would love it. All right, I'm going to send the link to the chat here. Okay. And
yes, please do.
It's an amazing person. It's a Hopkins Press book, Bodies in Doubt, An American History of Intersex.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, yes.
I mean, and it is like lucid. I mean, you went to some early history, but she ends up looking at Revolutionary War times and records and letters. She's a historian who's now at CUNY, but she's a wonderful person, and I think you'd get I think you would benefit a lot from looking at this, as will everyone else here. And ironically, it's published at Hopkins.
Yeah, right. The great connection there. That reminds me of. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, well, we're talking book recommendations. I highly recommend the book as well, Histories of the Transgender Child, which is on my bookshelf. It is by Jules Gale Peterson. It's that green, purple, and orange book behind me. It is a great book that connects the history of gender-affirming care for trans people with the history of care that was given to intersex people. And I use the word care loosely because so much of intersex history is surgeries that are being performed on youth who have intersex conditions without proper consent. But there is a really interesting connection there in terms of how the physicians who were developing those surgeries conceptualized gender and how their idea of the sort of plasticity of gender was later reflected in trans healthcare. So highly recommend that book as well if you haven't read it.
Thank you. I'm just about to order it.
Excellent. And then you had something else you want to say. Yes.
$23. So here's my second part of the second question I wanted to ask you is that, of course, in your presentation, you stipulated and you circumscribed your historical analysis as really referring to Europe and America. And particularly with reference to this idea about community. And I think you're absolutely right. But then when we look at Asia and particularly India, you already have that pre-existing community of hijras,
yes,
which I'm sure you're familiar with. And there's something really interesting that those communities existed and were supported. And it was only as a product or a result of the British colonization that they became marginalized. right? And I think that this is fascinating. And I wondered if you had any insight on that.
Yes, I mean, that's a great point. And I will say right off the bat that I thought so much about what the parameters I was going to set on this presentation were going to be. And I sort of centered in on 19th century Europe and America, in part because there's so much trans history to talk about. There's so many rabbit holes I want to dive down. And I think you're right. The history of colonization is such a major factor, both in India as well as in the US, right? There is a really brutal history of, I mentioned Two-Spirit folks at the beginning of the presentation,
Right.
the sort of brutal ways in which binary gender was enforced on those communities. There's a great artist actually named Kent Monkman who does work sort of from Two-Spirit identity. He has an exhibition here in Akron right now, so if y'all want to make the drive up to see some amazing Two-Spirit paintings, do so. But you know, I guess the story of colonization and the ways that it impacts kind of transness and our view of gender is excellent. I love his art so much. Oh my gosh. It's universal in all of the places that colonialism has touched. And so I think if we look at sort of the prehistory, you know, if we expand beyond sort of Western European conceptions of sex and gender, this history suddenly becomes so much more complex. It gains so much more depth. It gains so much more complexity because, you know, the ways that we conceptualize trans identity now, you know, can in some cases be mapped onto these other communities, but there's also these really distinct and interesting philosophies and theories of gender that you get in different countries and different communities and different cultures.
Right.
So I don't know if I'm expanding upon that or so much as I'm just saying it's really neat and I would love to talk more about it.
I agree. It's interesting. I wish that like, you know, I wish that somebody had done History of Sexuality, Foucault, in a global scale, and no one has done that yet, right? So it's I can see that all these wonderful gaps need to be filled. But thank you very much, Tony.
Yeah, thank you. And I saw that Sheila had her hand up as well.
Well, along the line of different sexual identities, I understand in Hawaii, the Hawaiian culture had more than two genders, at least 3 or 4, from what I understand, prior to colonization.
Yes.
But that wasn't my question. It's kind of way over on the other side. Are you familiar with the support of the federal government in trans care? I mean, I'm just wondering if you know anything about the history. I was a nurse in the VA hospital system, and I took care of a trans woman who, at the time when women were having their breast implants traded out from silicone to saline, she had her breast implants removed from and switched over at the VA. And so the federal government paid for that. I just wondered how much support, if you're aware of how much support the federal government's given to trans people. And
Yeah, that is
that wasn't the only one, but there were several. So I was just wondering if you knew anything about that history.
That is a fantastic question. So what I will say based on my understanding of this history is that sort of questions around kind of should the government be willing to pay for this, you know, should this be something that is accessible to folks, is actually much more recent than I think a lot of people think. When you look at the early history of trans healthcare, folks are really kind of trusting the experts in like a very major way, right? You don't necessarily get as much backlash. There are definitely people who are sort of, you know, not willing to gender people correctly, right? Who are, you know, balking at this from a social standpoint. But from a medicinal standpoint, you know, funding for these things is not particularly controversial early on. And it's once you get a little bit later into the 20th century that you start to see more of that backlash. I would say around 80s, 90s that you do start to see, as people become more aware of it and begin talking about it more, that's where you start to see a little bit more of that backlash. I don't know the specific history about things like the VA in terms of providing gender affirming care. My understanding is that the more explicit sort of policies, you know, that are saying, yes, it is written into our policy, we will cover this, those are mostly products of the 21st century. I think that prior to the 21st century, what you see more is trans people seeking out care through sort of loopholes, negotiating with individuals, sort of maybe fudging the numbers a little bit on certain diagnostic criteria, things like that, in order to access those networks of care. But I don't know. That's actually a really good question that I want to look into more the specifics of kind of how the federal government reacted to all of those things and ways in which they tried to enforce or not enforce binary gender through that process. So thank you. You've given me something to research. Yes, Barbara.
So I'm thinking about that the trans and the whole LGBTQ community is a target these days because of it's such a good scapegoat, and it's a way to get everybody else mad and worked up and just used as a tool in that way. And that sort of parallels what happened with the Nazis, I think. Although
Very
I'm not
much.
historian. But what I'm wondering about is what happened in the 60s. Well, I guess the rise of voting rights and of Black rights that brought along the violence against Stonewall and so forth at that era. Do you have a sense of how that fits all together?
Yeah, so I think that, the movement for LGBTQ rights, I think, moves at a slightly different pace than the movement for civil rights for Black Americans. I think that, in the 60s, we do have the civil rights movement is kind of at its peak, I would say, 50s and 60s. And the gay rights movement is chugging along, but it is very much that sort of respectability politics model of gay rights. It is cisgender, mostly white, gay men and women who are very specifically fighting against employment discrimination and very specifically fighting against sort of for, just protections in terms of housing and things like that, right? There's a whole sort of thing that goes down in the federal government in the 1950s called the Lavender Scare, where it's during the sort of Red Scare, the McCarthy era. And what happens during that time is that thousands of gay men and women who work in the federal government or federal employees who are suspected of being gay are fired because of, they could be easily blackmailed by the communists, is the argument that is made. It's really an excuse to just, scapegoat a population, right? So that is happening, and that's kind of fueling this sort of very respectability-focused vision of gay rights. But again, that is, because it is so focused on respectability politics, it is really led by wealthier folks who have privilege, folks who are who are a target of, being fired from their jobs, but aren't a target of things like police harassment, at least not in the same way. And so what's interesting is you have this kind of period of gay rights kind of chugging along alongside the civil rights movement. And then Stonewall happens, and Stonewall is a culmination of something completely different. Stonewall is a culmination of decades of working class queer folks of color, trans folks, going to these underground venues that, are being raided by the police on the regular. They're facing harassment. Often these venues are owned by the mob, and so they're having to deal with just like violence at these venues in addition to the harassment from police. And this is going on for decades and decades and decades. And this is kind of happening on a separate track from the respectability politics focused gay rights movement. And so the culmination that sort of happens there with Stonewall is that gays in this one bar get fed up with being harassed. And so that rage explodes. And then that explosion of rage resonates with enough people in that neighborhood that they get together and turn it into a bigger riot. And then that proceeds to, resonate with folks elsewhere in the country where similar events happen. And so it's interesting. Stonewall, I think from then on, the gay rights movement starts to follow sort of more of a sort of broader civil rights track in terms of the community really becoming more visible, really openly, actively, loudly fighting for their rights. That's when you see things like the Gay Liberation Front that I mentioned earlier. But even then, that also kind of gets derailed a little bit because then the HIV/AIDS epidemic hits, and suddenly it goes from we are trying to be out and proud and fight for our rights, and now we have to worry about the fact that folks in our community are dying. And then the focus shifts again toward research and treatment for AIDS, as well as the rise of the fight for marriage equality, which is very much focused around the rights of people to see their dying loved ones and to have some agency in what happens after their loved ones pass away. All of that gets us into the era of gay marriage, which there's a whole sort of discourse around the sort of whether or not that should have been such a major endpoint for the community, right? We have gay marriage, but the community is still under attack. And now then sort of the backslide that we're in now. I'm not sure if I actually answered your question or if I just rambled about a lot of history, but I hope that answered the question a little bit. Good. In case you can't tell, I love talking about this stuff, and I very often will just get on a side quest getting enthusiastic about this history.
So I have one more question, but I'm willing to put it on the back burner to see if anyone who hasn't had the opportunity to ask a question would like to ask a question before we wrap up. No? Okay. So Tony, I was just wondering, why do you think so many trans women are featured in history and not so much trans men?
Oh, that is an interesting question. I think that part of it is because of how we think about masculinity and femininity. There is generally in society, and I want to really strongly preface this by saying I am not trying to say that trans men or trans masculine people have it easy in any way whatsoever. I want to be very clear on that. But society normalizes masculinity as kind of the neutral. And so I think that very often in history, women, people who are assigned female at birth, who are transitioning toward a more masculine appearance, are seen as just kind of part of the broader feminist movement, right? These are just folks who are just trying to attain the same rights and sort of, livelihoods as men. This is part of the broader feminist movement. And there's less of a sense that this is its own separate radical thing that's happening. Whereas I think that in history, folks have had a harder time wrapping their heads around why someone who is assigned male at birth would want to wear a dress, right? There's this devaluing of femininity, this sort of particular abnormality of someone who is seen as being in a place of privilege, putting themselves in a less privileged place, right? And that's where you get a lot of this idea of just like trying to diagnose these people, right? Trying to understand this phenomenon, right? Like in the history of the West, which I alluded to at the beginning of the talk, there are countless instances of folks who are assigned female at birth donning men's clothes and going out west. And for the longest time, historians were just like, oh yeah, that's just a woman who, wore men's clothes for safety. And yet we have all of these instances of like folks who are assigned female at birth who do this, establish themselves in a town, and then just keep on living as men well after the question of safety becomes a point of concern, right? And so I think that historians and society are better at rationalizing the transmasculine experience, at least in sort of the early 20th century and in the 19th century, whereas the sort of transfeminine experience was seen as more of an anomaly and therefore put transfeminine people in the spotlight and forced them, I think, to maybe be a little bit more vocal in their activism.
Well, thank you so much for your depth of knowledge and your incredible insight. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been lovely talking to y'all. I'm going to put my email in the chat one more time here as well. If anyone wants to follow up with any more questions or book recommendations, or if you want book recommendations for me or anything, please feel free to send me an email. Again, in case you can't tell, I love talking about this stuff. So happy to keep the conversation going.
Thank you, Tony. That was excellent.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony. Fabulous. What a great way to spend Thursday evening. Thank you very much.
Oh, and you know what? Since I didn't say it earlier, happy Pride, y'all. Enjoy the rest of your Pride Month.
Bye, everyone.
To be continued.
Yes. Bye, y'all. Have a great night.
Bye.